You know, guys, as we get started on this one, hey, it's an hour, 20 minutes until the dinner. We won't take an hour and 20 minutes to do this, but I think it'll take about an hour. And this is probably the most studying I've had to do for any chapter so far, because this is the longest chapter in Daniel. It's the most detailed prophecy in the entire Bible, or the most detailed chapter on prophecy in the entire Bible. Very specific. We'll be going through this and you'll be thinking, this doesn't sound like a prophecy. This sounds like reading a history book. And it's very specific, but this is how precise God's prophecy is that even beforehand, it is giving specific details that came to fulfillment. And so, as you can also imagine, this is one of the most attacked chapters of Daniel, where people try to say, oh, well, there's no way Daniel wrote this stuff before it happened. And if I didn't believe in Bible prophecy and the miracles and all that, I mean, hey, I'd be right with him. But we do believe God, if he knows everything, he knows the future, and he can be as detailed as he wants. And so, since this has been the most detail-heavy lesson I've had to prepare, and it's not been a terribly tough week, because I started on this 3 weeks ago. I knew how tough it was going to be. But since this is so specific and I've had to do so much, it's a lot for me to remember. So let's pray before we get going that I can remember details, convey them clearly, that you guys can understand them. And by the way, if I get going too fast, or if you need me to slow down, please tell me. I don't mind slowing down. We don't even have to get through it all today. But let's pray real quick. Dear Lord, thank you for this chapter. This is an amazing chapter. I want all of us in here to walk out today thinking, wow, that is an amazing chapter. Luke was right. So, Lord, help me to communicate it well. Help me to remember the stuff you want me to say, and that we could just understand it. Just help me to communicate the best that I can, as your Holy Spirit can empower me. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. You know, by the way, I said we don't have to get through the whole chapter. I don't even want to try to get through the whole chapter. This chapter is 35 verses, 40 verses, something like that. It's like the longest chapter in Daniel. And I don't want to try to even get through all of it. So what we're going to do, the next chapter is the shortest one in Daniel. This one is like the longest one in Daniel. So I'm going to try to get through a little bit over half of this one. And then next week, we'll finish up this chapter and do the last chapter. It won't be too difficult to do it that way. And so let me remind you guys where we are in the story of Daniel. You know, as we were going through the book, it was really easy. One chapter was basically one story or one vision or whatever. And every chapter was like one thing. The last 3 chapters of Daniel, this is like a 3-part story. Okay? Chapter 10 is the introduction to this grand vision. Chapter 11 is this grand vision or prophecy, whatever you want to call it. And then chapter 12 is going to be the conclusion and the reaction to this vision. And so the last 3 chapters are one continuous story. And I just put that up there to remind you guys where we are in the whole, the scope of the whole book here. So tonight, I just want to get through the first, it's like 25 or 35 verses, I don't remember, but we'll just try to get through them. Make sure you got your Bible there. If you don't have a New King James, grab one of them from under the chairs, because that's what I'm going by. And then we can all be on the same page, literally. And yeah, we're all on the same page, but also we're all using the same translation so we can understand. Let's just get through the first verse here, because this first verse, it's actually finishing the sentence that we ended on in the last chapter. It says, also in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. And the person talking is this angel who came and visited Daniel in chapter 10. Do you guys remember how he said, I tried to get here 3 weeks ago, but there was a demon who got in a fight with me, and we were fighting for about 3 weeks and got in this long scuffle. Finally, I got here to tell you this vision. So that's where we pick up from last time. So that's who's talking. That's who's giving us this prophecy here. What this chapter is going to do, this angel is going to tell us about 5 future kings. Now, of course, this vision or prophecy happened back in the year 530 BC, something like that, okay? This vision happened 2,500 years ago. So out of the 5 future kings it's going to tell us about, 4 of them have already lived and died. So for us, a lot of this is history. I'm just going to be telling you guys a lot of history. If you guys remember chapter 8, we talked about Alexander the Great and Antiochus Epiphanes, and we just told stories from history, and I thought that was probably the best lesson we've had the whole time. I just enjoyed that one a lot, learning about history. That's what this one really is too. It's history again. So we're going to talk about 5 future kings. Verse 2 is going to tell us about this first of the future kings. The angel says, "And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece." Okay, so what the angel is saying is we start off on King Darius. He says there will be 3 more kings, and then there's going to be a king of Persia who's far grander than all of them. And this king is a guy named Ahasuerus. I think here's a slide about him right here. And that's just an artist's picture of him. I don't have the dates that he lived because this was a long time ago. We aren't even sure what years he lived. But King Ahasuerus, he's talked about there in verse 2. And so as that verse was saying, he made the Persian Empire so great that the Greeks were going to say, hey, that guy's ruling the world. I want what he has. And so they're going to want it. And so that's what it tells us about in his verse, that he made the Persian Empire so great, later it would provoke the Greeks that they would want to try to conquer it. And what else is cool about this guy, King Ahasuerus? He's also mentioned in the book of Esther. If any of you guys know the story of Esther, he's the king that Esther marries. And so there's a whole book of the Bible that's really a lot about him, King Ahasuerus. And that was about 75 years after Daniel was alive. Now, I also put a note, in some translations, he's called Xerxes. I mean, you could go either way. Yeah. Why is that? You know, there's lots of people in history who had different names for different situations. I don't remember what the circumstances are for him having 2 different names, but yeah, they go by different names. Like King Darius in the book of Daniel, Darius is a title. It means the one who holds the scepter. Like, that's just a title they just adopt that. I'm not sure why. Okay, so King Ahasuerus, he's talked about in the book of Esther. In fact, it says, I won't read all this. You don't have to write this down. But it talks about him in Esther. And it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the citadel, blah, blah, blah. He showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days. So it's just about how majestic this king was. And that's what the prophecy was about in Daniel chapter 11, verse 2. So he's the first of these 5 kings. Let's go on to the next one. King Ahasuerus just gets 1 verse. Now in verse 3, let's read the next 2 verses. "Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others beside these." Now, I think that after studying this guy 3 times already in the book of Daniel, we should know who this is. Who is this guy who had his kingdom broken up into 4 parts? Someone's got to know it, because we've talked about him 3 times. Alexander the Great. There we go. Alexander the Great. The second of the 5 future kings in this chapter is Alexander the Great. And so, again, you don't have to memorize which verses. You can write it down, but you don't have to memorize which verses. He lived from 356 to 323. And then the notable thing about Daniel 11 is that it specifically says, "And none were ruled by an heir." Now, none were ruled by an heir. That means none of the 4 parts of his kingdom would go to one of his children. Now, that is what typically happened. You were king, and then one of your children was king, and then one of their children was king, and they kept it in that family. So this is pretty amazing that this prophecy is not just saying that we've heard this a few times already, that it'll be divided into 4 parts, but even mentions here, it won't be ruled by one of his heirs. Or I think it called it his posterity. What did it say exactly? "None among his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled." What does posterity mean? It just means like your descendants, right? Like I think of in the preamble to the Constitution, I think, "To ourselves and our posterity." You guys remember that? It's talking about their future people after us. That's who they founded the country for. Okay, so that is the second one. You've probably written down about him now. Let's look at verse 5. It says, "And also the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion, and his dominion shall be a great dominion." So it talks here about the king of the south. And what you got to remember is that in the Bible, often directions are based on their relation to Israel. And so when it talks about the south kingdom, It's talking about what kingdom would be south of Israel, which that one would actually be Egypt. And anyway, a lot of this chapter is going to talk about the king of the south and the king of the north. And so we might say, well, what are the king of the south and the king of the north? Let me write, up here's north, okay? The kings of the north is Syria. And I'll show you it on a map in a minute. But a lot of this chapter is going to talk about two kingdoms, the north and the south, and these are Syria, and the southern one is Egypt. Now, what I want you to know about the kings of the north, these kings always had one of two titles in their name. They were either King Seleucid or they were King Antiochus. And so, just make a note of that when you read it, and this is, you guys, you'll use this in probably high school history classes. These guys will come up. The Seleucids and the Antiochuses. But those were the kings of the north. And then the kings of the south, it's kind of a weird name to say, they were the Ptolemies. All these kings of the south, their family name was Ptolemy. So they were the Ptolemies. They'd be King Ptolemy the first, King Ptolemy the second. The northern ones were King Seleucid the first, the second, the third, or they'd put on the name Antiochus. Now here's a map so you can just kind of see. And I gave you this map back in chapter 8. We talk about Alexander the Great. This was all Greece, and then he died. And the generals fought over who would get to be the next leader, and basically they each got a different chunk. There was Macedonia went to Cassander. This went to a guy named Lysimachus. This was the Syria by the Seleucids, and down here was the Egypt area, and the Ptolemy general got that. General Ptolemy got Egypt. General Seleucid got Syria, and that's what we're focused on here. This is the northern kingdom. This is the southern kingdom. It's kind of weird because the north and south are right here, and then these are the east and west. So we talk about north, south, east, and west, but the east and west weren't in the middle. They were actually over here on the side. But we're just going to focus on, you can see these are much greater, and there's a lot of prophecies about the king of the north and the king of the south. So Syria is about right here. Egypt is down here. And what's right here in between them? Israel. Israel's right there in the middle. So they're going to be in the middle of all these conflicts. And for hundreds of years, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were clashing. They just got in lots of fights. And so early on, there was a king, Ptolemy, which is down here, Ptolemy II. And the way that their names would work is they'd be Ptolemy II, and then he'd have another name. His name was Ptolemy II Philadelphus. You don't have to write this down. But I'm just going to draw a smiley face. I'll even give you a handout with these guys. Okay, this is Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and I'll give him some hair. But he got this idea, well, I know how I can make peace. The king up here, his name was Antiochus II. Antiochus II Theos. And I'm going to give him a beard and some hair. I'm going to give him Donald Trump hair. There's Antiochus II Theos. And Ptolemy says, this is early on in the conflict, but he says, let's just try to make peace, because we've had all this fighting and battle going on. So he had a daughter, and her name was Berenice. And he said, how about you just marry my daughter, and then that'll unite our kingdoms, and then we'll get along again. So he sent Berenice up here. Berenice, she married Antiochus. Now, that was the only way they thought they could have peace. Antiochus II Theos, he actually already had a wife. And she was a bit of a tough woman. Let me give her curly hair. And her name, I'm going to give her mean eyes, because she was a mean lady. Her name was Laodice. Now, her name might sound kind of familiar, because Antiochus II Theos, he actually built a city and named it after her, because he did love her a lot. And so, what is the name of that city? Laodicea, yeah. It's talked about a few times in the New Testament. Got a very famous letter about it in Revelation. But Laodice, that was his first wife. And so basically he divorced her and he married Berenice because they were trying to unite the kingdoms and have peace. Well, he even gave her like a really good tax break. I'm not kidding. He said, I'm going to have to divorce you, but let me give you a real good deal on taxes so your land won't be taxed. And he thought that would make her happy, but that wasn't good enough. So anyway, life went on for a little while. I think it's talked about that in the verses here. In verse 6, it mentions this. Let's read that before we go on. It says, at the end of some years they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement. And so that's what this was, that they got married. Well, anyway, Antiochus Theos, he died not too long later. And a lot of people think it was actually Laodice who had him poisoned, but they aren't sure about that. And so now they were trying to decide who the next heir should be. His first son was from Laodice. And so his name, I'm going to give him not as bad Donald Trump here as his dad, but his name was Seleucus. See, they go back and forth between these names. He was Seleucus II, and his full name was Callinicus. Berenice also had a son, but he was still a baby. So we're just going to call him baby Antiochus. And, of course, she wanted her son to be the next king. And Laodice wanted her son to be the next king. And she said, well, before Antiochus died, he said he wanted our son to be the next king. Well, Berenice is like, well, I'm his current wife, and I say our son should be the next king. So they started this fight up there. Berenice called her brother. By that time, Ptolemy II died, so Ptolemy III is now the king. But this is Berenice's brother, because they're both children of this guy. So she calls her brother, and she's like, could you come up here? I'm going to give him sunglasses. And she's like, can you come up here and settle this conflict? Because I want my son to be the king. And Laodice wants her son to be the king, and it should be... Anyway, she called him to come up to the northern kingdom and said, can you come up here and settle this? Well, by the time he got up there, Laodice had killed Berenice and her baby, so that only her son could be the next king. And so what happened then was that started the Laodicean War. And by the way, when she did that, Seleucus, the second Callinicus, he did become the next king. That started the Laodicean War. So it talks about that here, still in verse 6, I think. But she, this is Berenice, she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand, but she shall be given up. See, she didn't retain her authority because they died, and her power was given up. With those who brought her, with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. But from a branch of her roots, from a branch of Berenice's roots. Here's the root, she's one branch, here's the other branch. So it's talking about Ptolemy III now. From a branch of her roots, one shall arise in his place, who shall come with an army, enter the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. And he shall carry their gods captive to Egypt, with their princes and their precious articles of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So that's exactly what happened. He came up and he finds out his sister's been killed, and he kills Laodice then, so she's gone. The city was still around, but she's dead now. And they get into a conflict here, and he beats this guy. He doesn't kill him, but he beats him. And like I said, he takes all their gods captive back down to Egypt. Now, what is the point of taking someone else's idols? You know, that's how these things worked, is they had their gods, and down here they had their gods. Why would you take someone's gods and steal them? They weren't even your gods. Like, what do you think the message is probably trying to say then? Yeah, it's like saying, oh, I'm better than your gods. You know, I can take your gods. Which I guess you can do that with an idol. And anyway, the Egyptians, they had a lot of gods. You guys kind of probably have heard about that before. They had all these different gods. And so when he brings them down, they're like, ooh, more gods, more people to worship. And so they gave him the name Euergetes. And that means the benefactor, in their language. That means benefactor. A benefactor is someone who gives you stuff. So they're like, we're going to call you Ptolemy Euergetes because you've given us more gods to worship. They were all excited about it. And then it says in verse 9, also the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return home to his own land. Callinicus tried to come get his gods back, but he couldn't do it. Egypt was too powerful. And so, anyway, he just had to go back and kind of hang his head in shame. But his sons will be more successful. Verse 10, however, his sons shall stir up strife and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come to overwhelm and pass through, and he shall return to his fortress and stir up strife. Okay, so Laodice, she dies right at the beginning, but it started a 17-year, the Laodicean War, and that's what they called it, because she started it. So for 17 years, these guys fought, and eventually, he could not ever get his gods back, but he had two sons, okay? One of them was Seleucus. What number are we on now? The third. Yeah, one of them was Seleucus the third. He became king, but he didn't last very long. He died very quickly. But he had another son, and this guy was named Antiochus the third. And he called himself Antiochus the Great. Antiochus the Great. And he's actually the one we'll focus on for the next 10 verses. He's the third of these 5 future kings. Yes? There's Antiochus III. So that's what he probably more looked like, I guess. But anyway, he's the third of these future kings that he's talking about. And so this king, Antiochus III, he will be much more successful. He meets the king down in Egypt. Now we're on to another Ptolemy. Let me just write that here. Because time passes, Ptolemies die. This Ptolemy was named Philopator. I'll give him a face too. He's sleeping. Okay. There's Ptolemy Philopator. Okay. Now, they meet in battle. So verse 11, it says, the king of the south shall be moved with rage and go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude. But the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy. Basically, he's still successful and he beats Antiochus' multitude. When he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up and he will cast down tens of thousands, but he will not prevail. Do we still have that map? Okay, it's somewhere there. Basically, he was so successful, he thought, well, now Antiochus III will never try to get me again. So he went off toward India to try to conquer more territory. That's what this Ptolemy did. Now, while he was gone, as you can probably imagine, Antiochus just wanted revenge. So he starts building up an army again. And here's what it says and while Ptolemy's away, we go on to Ptolemy V. Antiochus is still king over here, but Ptolemy V is also asleep still. Okay, he does. He's got a frown. I'm going to give him an eye patch. What? Just because. I need to differentiate them somehow. So now Ptolemy V is king. He comes back. Antiochus has built this big army to finally get revenge. Antiochus III. So verse 13. For the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times many shall rise up against the king of the south. So he's getting people to follow him. He even gets some of the Jewish people to join in. It says, also violent men of your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fall. In verse 15, so the king of the north shall come and build his siege mound and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops will have no strength to resist. Now, the significant thing about Antiochus III, here's the note I would like you to make about him. Antiochus the Great, first he lost to Egypt, but he spent many years rebuilding his army to take revenge on them. He was so successful, he took the land of Israel back into Syrian territory. Now that's significant for the future, we'll get there. But the note about him is that with his fights, he took the land of Israel and conquered it for himself. He took it from Egypt and made it part of Syria. It's called the glorious land in the verses. When you see the glorious land mentioned, it's talking about Israel. And that's why it says in verse 16, but he who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power. And one of the things that he does now, Antiochus the Great, and as a way to try to make peace with the Ptolemies now, he sends his daughter, and her name's Cleopatra. I get to draw a girl. I think it's easier to make the girls look different because there's so many hairstyles for girls. Look at that. So he makes peace by taking his daughter, and he marries Cleopatra to Ptolemy V, the king of the south. And it mentions that in verse 17. He shall set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus he shall do, and he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy it. It says, but she shall not stand with him or before him. See, he sent his daughter down to marry this guy to kind of control Ptolemy V. But what ended up happening was she liked him a whole lot more than she liked her dad. And so she ended up not actually being that much of a help. She ended up being more of a help for him against her dad. But they kind of made a peace for a little while. It's not going to last long. And now this is what eventually happened to Antiochus III. He called himself Antiochus the Great. Who do you think he wanted to be like?
Alexander.
Yeah, he wanted to be like Alexander. And he looked at, well, I'm not going to throw the map up again, but he saw all that Alexander the Great conquered, and he wanted to be the same. And so he started heading back toward to conquer. He felt like he had the Ptolemies under control, so he was going to go try to conquer the east and west kingdoms. But about that time, Rome was over there. And Rome, as you guys know, Rome's going to be the next world empire. So they're building strength, they're building momentum. So Antiochus III heads out there to conquer Rome, but they end up being more than he can handle. He can't handle them. And so he turns around and heads home. So verse 18, After this he shall turn his face to the coastlands, and shall take many, but a ruler shall bring the reproach against them to an end, and with the reproach removed, he shall turn back on him. He shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall, and not be found. And so he couldn't conquer the Roman area, so he just ran away and started trying to run as far away as he could, and he ended up getting killed on his way out. He got killed in Persia, actually. But anyway, so he died. And Antiochus the Third, the Great, his next son was another Seleucus. And what are we on now? We're on Seleucus the Fourth, another Philopator. I don't know why they don't have more unique names. We had a Philopator down here and another Philopator. I don't know. But anyway, he doesn't last long. I'm going to give him kind of girly hair. And he's not going to last very long. He only gets one verse about him. It says in verse 20, there shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or battle. So basically, Seleucus the Fourth, he finds himself owing a bunch of money to the Romans. My guess is it's probably because his dad had been fighting the Romans, and he ended up having to pay them a bunch of money to make peace with them because he couldn't beat them. And so now Seleucus owes them a bunch of money, and Seleucus couldn't pay it, so what did he do? He started taxing the Jewish people to pay it off. It says he imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom. That's because he didn't know where to get the money from, so he started taxing the Jews to try to pay off this debt. Well, the Jewish financial advisor guy who was supposed to make the taxes, he ends up like stabbing Seleucus in the back right after that happened. So he didn't like his people getting taxed. But that's all he was known for, I guess. I think this is probably what started, in the New Testament, you hear about all the tax collectors all the time and how bad they were and no one liked them. That's probably where this kind of started from, this guy here starting the tax thing. So
because he stabbed it?
No, not because he stabbed him, but that's probably just where that tradition came from. All right, that's going to bring us to the fourth king now. Out of these 5 kings, we're on to the fourth one. It says in verse 21, and in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. So who is this 5th king? Well, Seleucus here, he had a baby, and his name, he's just another baby Antiochus. He was going to be named after Grandpa. Well, baby Antiochus, once he got killed kind of early, so baby Antiochus was not ready to be king yet. He was still a baby. And so they had a cousin, and this cousin said, I'm going to give him a really scary beard and some mean eyes and big black eyes. There we go. And just a little bit of hair on top, a mohawk.
That's Zod.
It's Zod.
That looks like a tornado.
It's like a DNA strand on his head.
Do you not know how to...
No, I don't. Okay. It's not going to matter. So, cousin here says, well, I'll step in and do the family a favor. Since baby Antiochus is too young to be king, I'll just be king for a little while until he gets older. Now, cousin here actually has some evil intentions. As it said, he shall come in peaceably, but seize the kingdom by intrigue. And so, after a few years, this guy decides he would just rather be the king. So he kills the baby, so there's no one else left to be king. And this guy's name is Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes. Now, do you guys remember studying him before?
Yes.
We even reviewed a little bit of that, or we talked a little bit about that story back in chapter 8. So Antiochus the Epiphanes here, and let's recap his story so that you guys can be refreshed on it. I got a handout. Let me give you guys a handout with all these. Well, sorry.
They're all hipsters.
I made all the Antiochuses and Seleucids have beards.
They're all hipsters.
Yeah, these are all geeks. Freaks and Greeks. Okay, so that kind of differentiates. All the northern ones had beards and the southern ones were clean shaven. But anyway, you can stick that in your book. I just, of course you don't have to memorize all this because this is kind of crazy. Look, and what's kind of funny is the Ptolemies were just kind of consistent. And these guys just had so much fighting just among themselves that their family tree kind of looks crazy. One last thing I'll mention is that we're on Ptolemy the 6th now, down here. But, he's not going to be, he's just the king of the south. We don't really need to talk about him even. But the 4th king that we're talking about today, Antiochus Epiphanes. And You can write down whatever notes you want to about him. I didn't have we talked about him so much in chapter 8, but we didn't finish his story. And so I'm going to finish his story today. Okay, there's Antiochus Epiphanes. Now we can recap his story a little bit. So he becomes king of Syria, and there was the high priest of Israel, because now you guys got to remember, so Israel was taken over by Syria in this chapter. So the high priest of Israel, and I'm going to give him a funny hat, an Abraham Lincoln hat, I guess. That's what it turned out to be. His name was Onias. So this is the Jewish guy. He's the Levitical high priest of Israel. And there's another guy. Do you guys remember Jason? Now, I still kind of I almost can't say that with a straight face. Jason. There was a priest in the Old Testament named Jason, but his name's Jason, okay, for real. And I'm going to give him sunglasses and some cool hair.
That's not very cool.
You have a leather jacket.
He has a smirk.
A leather jacket. I'm not drawing bodies. Last time I think I drew bodies for
You
him.
did,
but-
yeah, he has a leather jacket.
Oh, yeah. And you guys remember Menelaus? I put a cowboy hat on him. Wasn't that what I did? Let me give him a cowboy hat. Okay. Menelaus right here. So let me kind of recap you guys what had happened before. Onias is the high priest in Jerusalem, in Israel. Antiochus Epiphanes becomes the new king. This guy was just all about money. I mean, that was kind of his thing. Probably because now they owed these debts to Rome, and they're trying to pay him off, and they were taxing the Jews and all that. Okay, so Jason gets a bunch of money, and he offers it to Antiochus Epiphanes and says, if I give you just a bunch of money, will you kill Onias and make me the new high priest? That was his plan. And Antiochus Epiphanes is like, money, sure. So he kills Onias. And now Jason is the high priest. So literally there used to be high priest Jason in Israel. That just still cracks me up. There was a high priest named Jason. So in verse 22, it tells about this. With the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him and be broken. It's talking about how dangerous Antiochus Epiphanes was. And also the prince of the covenant. That's Onias. He's broken. The prince of the covenant, because he's the high priest. So they shall be broken before him. And after league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. So they make a league with him. He acts deceitfully. He's a politician. I mean, you can't really trust him. It says in verse 24, he shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. What's that talking about? What that's talking about, Antiochus Epiphanes, his forefathers would always steal from the rich and give to whoever they wanted to like them. But Antiochus Epiphanes had a different plan. He just stole from the rich and gave it to the poor. I know we think, oh, Robin Hood, he's a hero. Well, what he's doing here, he wanted to be so popular by the general population, most of whom were poor, that he stole from the rich. Those darn rich people, they got all their money stored up. He stole it from them and gave it to all the poor people to become popular. And it worked. He became popular that way. It says, he shall disperse among them plunder, spoil, and riches, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. Okay, so like I said, now we're on Ptolemy the Sixth, and he's down in Egypt. We talked about this in chapter 8, that Antiochus Epiphanes is the horn. He grew toward the south because he was fighting Egypt, King Ptolemy down in Egypt. And so it says in verse 25, he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yea, those who eat the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And that's really just talking about all these different battles that Antiochus was fighting against Ptolemy down in Egypt. Syria versus Egypt, Israel right in the middle. And they just got in all these battles. And Antiochus Epiphanes is a lot more successful. Now let's go on a rabbit trail for just a second. Do you guys remember in chapter 10 that the angel could not get to Daniel because he was getting in a fight with this demon? And this demon was named the Prince of Persia. Do you guys remember that? And he said, and next I've got an appointment to go fight the Prince of Greece. And so, why is it, this answers a good question for us. We talked about in chapter 10, the reason for what's this Prince of Persia? What's this Prince of Greece? There are demons who are assigned to certain countries, and they're supposed to just kind of influence the things that go on in those countries. They influence the leaders to do bad things. And so the demon of Greece is called the Prince of Greece. The demon of Persia was called the Prince of Persia. Now that answers this question for us. How come is it that king after king after king keeps doing the same thing? Why did the Seleucids and the Antiochuses and the Ptolemies, why did they just keep fighting again and again, century after century? They never get along. Why is that? Well, they told us back in chapter 10 to explain this. It's because there's a demon of Syria and there's a demon of Egypt, and maybe they don't like each other, or maybe they just want to cause conflict, but they keep the fight going. And that's why king after king after king in both countries does the same thing, because it's this demonic stuff. So these things are influenced by forces far above us, out of our control. But that explains why we just see the same things happening again and again. Why does the king of Babylon today, who was Saddam Hussein, which he's dead now, not literally today, but why does Saddam Hussein want to kill all of these Medes in his country? He killed 80,000 of them. Why does he want to do that for something that happened thousands of years ago? It's because it's the same demon influencing that. Still, the Babylonians are still fighting the Medes because they fought back in the book of Daniel. And they'll just keep on fighting. They're never going to get along because it's the same demons over these groups. That's just a rabbit trail. Okay, let's get back to it here. So Antiochus Epiphanes and King Ptolemy, they can't get along. It says in verse 27 that they're such liars that they can never make peace. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. So he was just not able to make peace with King Ptolemy down here, which I think we're on the 6th now. King Ptolemy the 6th. He just could not make peace with him. They just kept the fight going. Well, what's going on in Israel during this time? So Jason, he gets permission from Antiochus Epiphanes to go up and make a new city. He founded a new city, and he named it after his sugar daddy. He called it Antioch, in honor of him, I guess. So Jason goes and starts a new city called Antioch, which is also mentioned in the New Testament. It's the place where Christians got the name Christians. Before that they were called believers, or they called themselves people who followed the way. That was what Christianity started as. They called it the way. But in Antioch, they became called Christians because they followed Christ. So Jason is away in Antioch ruling, and while he's there, he's got this Menelaus with him, and he says, "Hey, Menelaus, I think I need to send some more money over to Antiochus Epiphanes just to keep the good relationship going, to make sure we're all still friends." So he gives his money to Menelaus and says, run over here to Antiochus and give it to him. Well, Menelaus is just not a trustworthy guy. Neither was Jason, for that matter. But Menelaus says, okay, sure. So he runs over and he gives him the money and he says, Antiochus, if I give you this money, will you kill Jason and make me the new high priest over Israel? And Antiochus Epiphanes is like, money, sure. So Menelaus comes back to Jerusalem, and he sets himself up as high priest, and he's waiting for Jason to get killed. Well, Jason gets back before Antiochus gets there. And Jason shows up, and he says, well, I'm the high priest. And Menelaus says, no, I gave the money to Antiochus Epiphanes, so I'm the high priest. So they start getting into a fight with each other, Jason's people versus Menelaus's people. Antiochus hears about it, and he's like, I can't deal with these Jews anymore. They're just causing all these fights. He just gets mad at them because of these two guys' personal conflict. So he says, that's it. We're just going to wipe the Jews out. We're just going to kill all the Jews, get rid of them. I'm tired of dealing with all these high priest stuff. And he killed 40,000 Jews in one day. And he enslaved 40,000 more. And 80,000 Jews were scattered. They all ran away. And so that's what it talks about here in verse 28. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage and return to his own land. So that's talking about when he came back and he killed all those 40,000 Jews and 80,000 were scattered. And then what happened after that? Verse 29. At the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. That means he won't be successful. So Antiochus, it says he's going to go back toward the south. He's on his way back down to Ptolemy, going to kick his butt again, and he's excited about it. I guess he's just in the mood for a fight. But he's on his way down and something happens that's not like the former or the latter. There's a Roman there. His name is Gaius Pompilius Lanus. We'll just call him Gaius. Okay, so this Roman is down here on the way, and his name's Gaius. And Antiochus comes down and he says, hey, can you get out of my way? I'm going down to kick King Ptolemy's butt. And Gaius is like, he's a Roman. He's like, guys, we're sick of all this fighting. The Syrians and the Egyptians going at it year after year after year. We're going to be the new big boys in town soon, and I'm telling you, if you keep this fight going, you're going to have the Romans after you now. And he even, according to the story, Gaius, he was sitting there talking to Antiochus face to face, and he drew a circle in the dirt around Antiochus Epiphanes and said, by the time you step out of that circle, if you've decided you're going to keep fighting the Ptolemies, we're just going to kill you now. But if you just turn around, step out of the circle, and go home, then you can keep ruling the Syrians. And so Antiochus knew he had no choice. He was very angry, though. So he stepped out of the circle, went back home, but now he's full of all this rage. And he can't pick on Ptolemy anymore, so who can he just take out his rage on? Anybody want to guess who he takes it out on? Okay, it'll tell us here in verse 30. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him. That was Gaius. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he's going after the Jewish people. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant, and forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. Okay, so what does that mean that he did? What is the abomination of desolation? Well, Antiochus Epiphanes goes back up to Jerusalem. He's just full of anger and rage. And he just thinks, how can I just take this out? Who can I pick on to take this out on? He's going to he's going to pick on the Jews and just try to kill them all again. And what he even does is he marches into the Jewish temple. And remember, this is still the Old Testament, so the Jewish temple, it's a holy place of God. And he walks in with a pig, and he cuts the pig's throat and spreads the blood all over God's temple. That might be what the abomination of desolation was. He did something else too. He put a statue of Zeus, because that was Antiochus Epiphanes' god. You guys know about Zeus. You've heard of him a lot. Watch the movie Hercules. He took a statue of Zeus and put it in God's temple. So he put an idol there. And spread the pig's blood all over the place and made it disgusting. Because you guys know the Jews they're very intolerant of pigs or anything related to hot dogs or whatever. And so this is called the abomination of desolation. Huge, significant event in the history of Israel. And of course, the Jews were just pretty upset about it. But what are they going to do against this guy? Well, verses 32 through 34. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. That means he was nice to some people and got them on his side with flattery. But the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. And those are the people who understand shall instruct many. Yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. Okay, let's go back to that part where it says, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. Well, what's that referring to? Well, when he did that to the temple, finally a group of Jews rose up and they said, we're not going to put up with this anymore. Now, they don't have an army where they can just go kick Antiochus Epiphanes' butt. They can't do that because he's too powerful. But they just start banding together and do this guerrilla warfare, this kind of behind the scenes, in the shadows, trying to take Antiochus Epiphanes down. And so the guy who led them, his name is Mattathias Maccabees. Mattathias Maccabees. And I'll give him a goatee and a smiley face. Even though, okay, he was not actually happy. He was very angry at Antiochus Epiphanes because this guy was desecrating his God's temple. And that made him sick. And so Mattathias Maccabees, he started a group of people. It was called the Maccabean Revolt because he was the leader. And they just went around from city to city. And anywhere that Antiochus Epiphanes had set up an idol or a statue, they tore it down. They destroyed all of his pagan altars, just going around city to city. They taught the Jews how to do circumcision, because that was one thing that Antiochus Epiphanes made it against the law to circumcise a baby boy. And you might think, well, what's the point of that? That's dumb. Why can't they just choose to do that? It's because in the Bible it said to circumcise the baby boy. So he made it against the law. And he just did a lot of crazy things. Threw babies off of rooftops. I mean, evil guy. Jewish babies, because he hated the Jews. So the Maccabees went around and they taught people how to do circumcisions. They destroyed pagan idols and pagan altars. It says in verse 35, and this is the last verse we'll read today about them, and some of those of understanding shall fall, to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for an important time. It's talking about these guys who were making things pure again. And basically for the last 3 years of Antiochus Epiphanes' life, The Maccabees made him very angry. Now, he did kill Mattathias Maccabees. But Mattathias, he had 2 sons. One was named Judas Maccabees. And the other one was named, what was his name? Jonathan Maccabees. I'm running out of ideas, guys. What should I put on their faces? A mustache. I'm going to give Judas Maccabees glasses and a smile. And I'm going to give Jonathan Maccabees a mustache and a little bit of hair on. I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, so there's Judas. They're the 2 sons. They're the last faces I need to draw today, thank goodness. Okay, so Mattathias died, but his sons carried on the Maccabean revolt. Because they said, we're not going to take it anymore. That's what they were trying to tell Antiochus Epiphanes. We're not going to take what you're doing. So eventually, they stormed the temple in Jerusalem. They stormed it. They cleaned up all the pig blood that had been there. They got all the idols out and destroyed them. They started up the temple sacrifices and all that. They know Antiochus Epiphanes is going to come and kill them for it. But they're like, no, we're taking the temple. We'll die here if we need to. We're standing here. We're not going to give it up again. Well, I think God must have heard their prayers or something, because Antiochus Epiphanes died right about that time of a disease. Nobody killed him. He just got a disease and died. I think it was from God. So his troops are coming. He sent his troops down to kill the Maccabees because they were there in the temple again. He's like, oh, good, we can just go finish them off. Well, while the troops are on their way, he dies of a disease. And so when the troops show up, they're like, oh, well, our king's dead, so I don't know if we really even have to do this anymore. So I guess they made peace with the Maccabees, and they turned around and went home. And Jonathan Maccabee became the new high priest. I think they killed Menelaus. I think Jason had been killed by him. I'm not sure. But anyway, they make peace. And so the Maccabees were able to take back the temple. Now, one last thing about their story. When they came back and took back the temple and the Syrian troops were marching there, they said, well, the only thing that we haven't restarted is they have there's a candlestick in the temple, and it's called the menorah. And I think it's got 7 heads on it.
7.
Yeah. So there's a menorah in there. And they said, well, let's start it up again. But as they were going to start it up, they're like, well, we only have enough oil to burn for 1 day. And so they're like, should we even bother if it's only going to burn for a day? Because they're supposed to keep it going all the time. And they said, well, let's just start it anyway because we want to restart all of the practices. So they put in the oil, they light the candles, and it doesn't burn for 1 day. It burns for 8 days straight. And they considered it just miraculous because they're like, we only had enough oil for 1 day, but it burned for 8 days. And after 8 days, they got some more oil and they were able to keep it going again. Now, I don't know, it's probably a miracle. It probably was. They considered it a miracle. It probably was. And ever since then, they have celebrated a holiday in honor of that. And it's called the Feast of Lights. Sometimes they also call it the Feast of Dedication. But there's another name that it's more commonly known by today. Anybody know what that is? Hanukkah, yes. So they burn that, and I think they celebrate for 8 days. And it's a Jewish holiday. And Jesus actually celebrates it in John chapter 10. So it's not like it's bad. It's not forced on the Jews in the Bible like the other feasts were. I'm not when I say forced, it's not like a command that you have to do it. But Jesus even observed it. Because like I said, that abomination of desolation, very significant in their lives, in the Jewish people's lives. And so if you want to see that, that's in John chapter 10, verse 22. Jesus was celebrating Hanukkah. But anyway, maybe there's one more kind of fun thing, and we'll close on this little tidbit today. One kind of fun fact about this whole story. So you guys remember what Hellenization means? We talked about that back in chapter 8 too. Right, yeah, what you guys were both saying. You take someone's culture away and you Greekify them. You try to get them to adopt the Greek lifestyle. Because the Greeks thought they were so awesome that everybody should be like the Greeks. And so, anyway, the name Jason, his name's not actually Jason. That was his Hellenized name that they changed. But his name's not really Jason. Yeah, I know. Well, his name was Jason, but they changed it. That wasn't his original name. Anybody want to know what his name was before?
What his original name was?
Not Jensen. Not Jensen. Before the Greeks changed his name to Jason to Hellenize him, his name was Jesus.
But
Now think about this.
Hispanical form.
No, his name was actually Jesus.
I know.
But think about this. This is hilarious. So in this story, 200 or 300 years, maybe 150 years before Jesus was even alive, there is a story of this Maccabean revolt that was so significant in their history. And one of the villains was named Jesus.
Oh,
and that one of the heroes was named Judas.
Oh.
Now, isn't that just kind of, don't tell me God doesn't have a sense of humor.
That's
Whenever,
contradicting.
I know. God has a sense of humor, I think.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that's the end of part 1. We'll take up part 2 next week, but look at this. Here's another place, and this is maybe it's just in English, I'm not sure. God has a sense of humor. So, the 5 kings of Daniel 11. We had Ahasuerus, Alexander the Great, Antiochus the Great, Antiochus Epiphanes. What's kind of funny about all those names?
A.
They all start with the letter A. I don't know, it just does.
The great, I wish I had it on
And
my
so does the
notes.
5th one. Does anybody want to guess who the 5th king is that Daniel 11 tells us about?
A.
Antichrist.
What?
Antichrist is the next one. And so that's where we'll pick up next week. But thanks guys for being here. This is a fun chapter. We got about 75% of the way through Daniel 11, but I think we've given enough download information today, don't you? Yeah.